Cool. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to figure out how to get my notes to show up, but I can't, so I'll just wing it. So I'm Sean Eddings. I work at Last Call Media. Yep.
Sorry, just going to interrupt him for 1 second.
Oh, fancy. Oh, the best. Awesome. Thank you so much. So, kind of beat me to it. So, Sean Eddings, I work at Last Call Media. I run our client services teams, so that means I deal a lot with risk. And when I was putting this presentation together, I thought, well, what's another way of describing what I do? I'm kind of like a risk mitigator. I'm involved in all of our projects, seeing how things are going, identifying things early and often, and making sure that there's clear communication throughout the process. There's a project manager in our office who started running around and writing haikus for things. So I thought this was pretty cool. Our project's timeline was written by Stephen King, terrifying fiction. I think some people here may be able to relate to that, when something rolls right out of sales and drops onto your plate, and you're looking at this and it's like reading a Stephen King novel. You know, just don't want to turn to the next page because you don't know what was promised and what you're unhooked for. So a little disclaimer here. I think what's great about risk is that I think it's difficult to have all the answers for it. So, and every situation being unique with the client team, the actual project, I think it's best that we review a few common scenarios. But the key here is making sure that there's space for an open and honest communication in the project about things that may go sideways, and being sure that there's a plan in place for those things to get back as quickly as possible. And for the critic, I don't want to come off as that, there are lots of things that go wrong in a project, but rather that I've seen some things, and I hope the techniques that I've found will be helpful. So, a couple truths that I think. Every project has risk. We don't want to scare people away. We don't want to weaken our status as experts, but we need to be aware that some things can cause a project to go sideways, and we want to make sure that the plan in place minimizes the impact. So, reducing risk means talking about risk. Truth number 2, ignoring risk, or just pretending like it's not there, can lead to pretty heavy and pretty high insurance premiums when a partner or an internal team is looking to farm something out or build a project, and the client is saying, no risk, none at all. This thing is crystal clear. We want to be sure that if we ignore it, then we have to account for that somehow. And a lot of times it ends up being high insurance premiums. And that kind of ties in quickly to confidence on a project. So when we're talking about ways to be fully on board and understand all the requirements, the cone of uncertainty, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of it. Pretty cool tool that helps illustrate kind of what we're talking about when a project begins and there's a lot of uncertainty and things are unclear and we're trying to figure things out and we need to estimate for those things. So at the beginning of a project, you'd say you're pretty, depending on how it started, you may be pretty uncertain as to the direction that you're headed. So you can document those things and prepare for those things and have a plan in place for those things. But if you're ignoring those things, then you need to account for those things. Risk is non-transferable. You can't transfer risk completely from one party to another, I think, if you're trying to set this project up for success. But you can have an open and honest conversation about risk. If anyone here was hoping to listen to how you can get someone else to take all the risk in a project, I unfortunately do not have the answer for that. So let's just make sure that there's space for an open and honest conversation, and we have a really great working relationship so that when things come up, we can mitigate them quickly and successfully. Risk, I think, is really important in helping inform critical decisions. Knowing whether or not something can be done within the timeline or the budget, I think definitely helps drive whether or not you're going to do it. There are trade-offs to a lot of things in complicated projects. For example, our site is we built it on Drupal 8 2 years ago, actually. So that was definitely a risk for us. We love it. It came out really well. But again, it informed critical decisions. We were pretty limited in terms of what we could do at the time. Now, I guess, there are definitely more options for us. But 2 years ago, it was quite the adventure. A client of ours, I think a few years ago, this is one of my favorite quotes from a client of ours. We were talking about all the things in this pretty complicated project, and his position was there's no risk, right? What are you talking about? Risk is just a business word for fear, so what are you afraid of? And we found that trying to use scare tactics is definitely not the way we want to talk about this. We're not afraid of risk. We just want to know what are all the things that may go sideways and have a plan for them. Just documenting them and then not forgetting about them. So no one wants to be in a conversation, especially with a new client or a new partner, and talking about all the things that can't be done, because that's not really what this is about. This is not about talking about what's not possible, because that, no one will hire you if you just were the person on the phone that's like, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. That's unlikely. I've heard this one quite a few times, and I'd say in most cases I'd agree. Most likely it's unlikely. But I'm the only stakeholder. Sometimes that's really great, but sometimes it's risky. There's that expression about all your eggs in one basket. Just use lorem ipsum for now. We'll figure out that content later. Definitely want to make sure that we know that this is a thing that people are considering. This one, another favorite of mine, there's nothing complicated about this integration. Just plug it in. Just hook it up to Drupal. Hardly nothing complicated about it. There are definitely simple things, for sure, but we want to be, let's not sell ourselves short. Another favorite, this plan has too much red. So in a minute we'll talk about how we calculate risk, and one of the ways that we do that is we use color coding in Excel, pretty cool, revolutionary feature, and it sort of marks columns accordingly, and we delivered a plan once. We were in that very beginning stage of a pretty serious project. It was a year-long project, and we had a lot of unknowns, and we were using this plan as a mechanism to have these conversations about the things that were unknown. So we articulated that in red. And one of the stakeholders said, there is too much red here. And another popular one that anyone's probably heard, there's no time to talk about this because there can be no delays. So you can do whatever you want, but no delays. I don't understand what's going on, but no delays. So we talk about risk, making a few jokes about risk. It's important that we don't weaken our status as experts, because inherently we're admitting that there are things in the project that we can't control. So despite all this, we've worked with some really great people at Last Call, and we've done some really great work for some really great folks. Last Call, the obligatory statement about us, if anyone in the room hasn't heard about us, we're a full-service digital agency, so a lot of our work helps organizations improve the spaces that they occupy. And we're risk takers. I think we're a 25-person firm, and we like taking calculated risks. One of those being our 2-year head start on Drupal 8. And we've been able to do complex work for large organizations because we're able to make sure there's space to have these difficult conversations about risk. And a lot of our clients started working with us and have continued working with us. So we have that long-term relationship with a lot of them. So, what is risk? This is straight from the dictionary. Risk is the possibility that something unpleasant or unwelcome will happen that could jeopardize a project. All right, cool. So, I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before, but I found this a few weeks ago and thought it was really great. There's an emotional cycle that goes into every project. A lot of times you start off and everyone's optimistic, right? Even if it's a rescue project, I think sometimes you're really optimistic about it. And you found a new person, a new solution. There's that honeymoon period. And then sometimes something happens along the way. Confidence is shaken. The first bump in the road. Things start to decline maybe. So what we're really talking about in this presentation is going from doubt to hope as quickly as possible. Having a plan in place to go from doubt to hope as quickly as possible. And I think if anyone in this room has worked on a project before, this kind of relates. I don't know. Anyone thinking that this is totally out of bounds? So yeah, plan in place to recover and quickly. So how do we make this valuable? We do a risk assessment where we need to identify, document, prevent, and then mitigate the risk. What this allows us to do is increase transparency between teams, increase project buy-in from stakeholders. A lot of times at large organizations, there are things that really are important to management, such as budget, timeline, and scope. And sometimes things can seem very overwhelming that can be completed in that amount of time. So if we're talking about all the things that could possibly come up, and we're engaging in an honest communication conversation about it, I think it helps increase buy-in from stakeholders. It also helps us with our confidence in our approach and solution by exposing initial assumptions. I've definitely walked into a project thinking something would go one way with regard to functionality or integrations, and been totally surprised that it went the other way. And that just happens. We understand the risks and the benefits. I like cookies, so I understand that if I eat a box of cookies every single day, it will probably lead to some serious health problems. So I've decided not to eat a box of cookies every day. Or maybe if I do decide that I want to eat that box of cookies every day, I will counter that with some time at the gym. Time at the gym by itself probably isn't that bad. And we can quantify the abstract to be able to make an informed decision. So, we don't want to scare people away by calling it a risk assessment, so we call it a risk and solution assessment. So we're accepting there's a risk and there's a solution for it. So how do we do this without scaring people away? I think it's a lot like eating your vegetables. You, as a kid, maybe you were really into vegetables, and that's awesome. No need to sugarcoat that. But some kids don't like their vegetables. So what do? You hide them under pasta, blend them into something, but you know that they need to get these nutrients. This is actually an analogy that someone in the office came up with when I was talking about this idea, and I think it makes a lot of sense to me. So anyway, you know that eating vegetables is important, so you need to figure out a way to talk about these things so that it actually happens. How do we do that? We start every conversation with this question: what are all the things? I'm sure I think it's a pretty common thing to ask. So it's a great way to articulate how we want to get the answers that we need. And since the creative process, potentially the riskiest process, is largely informed by business drivers, we want to make sure that we're uncovering all the drivers of this project. So we say, what are all the things? We pick out people's hopes and fears. Ask the room, which is ideally everyone in the client team, what their hopes and fears are. Everyone, meaning marketing, IT, communications, they're all going to have potentially different hopes and fears. And we want to make sure that we listen to everyone, because you don't want to launch something and IT wasn't involved in the conversation for some reason, and then course registration doesn't work. Communications may want to make sure that we take into account internal audiences being able to use this site easier. Maybe they're coming from a non-Drupal CMS or a non-CMS, and they have all these disparate sites, and there's a lot of internal pain points there. Colin is our creative director at Last Call. When I was talking to him about this, the creative process, he kind of goes, the sky's the limit, and there really are no boundaries. So when you're talking about all of the things that could potentially come into a project like this, I think that's true. So we're listening to people's hopes and fears, and we hear gems like this. It needs to kind of be alive with an element of new and different, which brings you in and keeps your attention. Definitely, 100%. I don't think anyone in this room would say, I think that's wrong. We want the site to be alive, and we want it to keep your attention. I would call this a vague and describable. Must have strong calls to action, making sure that people stay on the site and do something. They complete some sort of transaction. We got this one when we were working on a national ice cream chain. It's a fun place. Ice cream is serious fun. While the information is serious, sophisticated, and important, the element of joy and fun must be the big impression of the website. Pretty great. So everyone's in the room, we're all kind of thinking about things, and maybe this is what people have in their heads. There's a lot going from that to this, right? So I would say the sums of the hopes and the fears is the project output, what everyone is bringing to the table. And then we look for things that are unique and unusual. E-commerce with two-way QuickBooks integration. I want to make sure that we knew about that from the beginning of the project. Even though a user, an anonymous user, or a user conducting a transaction on the site may have no idea, this is an important consideration. Subscriptions are managed in Salesforce, content in Drupal. So we got a Salesforce integration here. Let's make sure that we don't forget about it. We're not sure if our current branding is effective. Definitely something we want to take into consideration. And we can't move forward until everyone in our company signs off on the design. Now, this one is actually, I won't say the name of the client, but they're a household brand. And I think everyone in the room would recognize them if I said it. But they're actually a really small company. I think they're only about a dozen people. So when everyone in our company has to sign off on something, on a small team, that sounded like it'd be okay, not that complicated. It took 2 years. And by then the design had atrophied. The site they started building the site on Drupal 6, launched it a year ago. So they launched a Drupal 6 site. Yeah. Lots of fun. So, to be organized and make sure that we all know what we're doing, we start every project with a project plan. The charter explains high level the goals of the project. However, to figure out what we're doing, we have this project plan, which is a relative living document. I think modern web development or modern digital solutions, you have to be, this can't be a project that's set in stone from the very beginning and you're tracking toward it. You need to be fully aware and build this thing accurately, but there are things that change. So that's why we use Google spreadsheets. But yeah, as we start to figure things out and recognize and highlight areas where requirements aren't clear or there's uncertainty with our approach, we highlight the risk and solutions assessment. And there are types of risk. There's a timeline risk. This item may impact project's overall timeline. There's a budget risk. We may not be able to do this within budget, or as is clearly defined, we're unable to identify what the budget for this may be. We need more time to talk about these things. Satisfaction. This may impact satisfaction with project deliverables. Scope. Item may impact the expected deliverables. Technical. Item requires further technical review, or this approach may limit the site's technical integrity. And project. This may impact project success. So this is all pretty abstract, and we need to quantify this to identify which are the biggest risks so that we talk about those, and maybe some of the smaller risks we can document and mention and keep in the back of our minds, but they're not necessarily showstoppers. So we use likelihood, improbable to near certainty that a risk will happen, and any item greater than 2 needs a prevention plan. So we recognize this as a risk, so what is the plan to prevent it? Severity, this has a minor impact to your business, or this is completely detrimental to the business. You can't launch without this. So when we talk about Salesforce's managing subscriptions and Drupal managing content, a showstopper there would be, and this isn't that big of a risk because Salesforce is widely adopted, but getting that Salesforce integration to work with Drupal. We've seen this with digital asset management systems. So, for example, if you are an organization that has a Drupal platform already and you'd like to pick a third-party integration that isn't already compatible with the platform, then you may you want to make sure that serious consideration is given to that before you embark on development. So any item greater than 2, again, use a mitigation plan. Should our plan to prevent not be successful? What is our plan to mitigate? And then to add to this, we need to be confident in it. So we can have a prevention plan and a mitigation plan, but how confident are we in our plan? Very high confidence, so 9 times out of 10 this has been successful, to no confidence, where this isn't something we're comfortable proceeding with. Let's figure out how to break this risk up or dedicate time to it. So we now have a bunch of numbers, and we multiply them across. So severity by likelihood, by confidence is our overall risk factor. And it kind of looks like this sometimes. And this is back to that project that's several years, will be about a year in the making. So this one definitely has a lot more risk than some other projects, like the smaller marketing type sites are definitely have significantly less risk, and the risk isn't as great. But this is tough to read, and I'm not about to go one by one. So I'll break down a few here into something that is easier to see. Satisfaction. Client isn't satisfied with the overall design direction. How many people in this room have found themselves with this result? I'm guessing a few, maybe more than a few. I like to call this our early detection system. So we provide frequent deliverables early and often to know smaller, more frequent deliverables to sort of get us to the actual full-blown design regularly, so we know that we're headed in the right direction. So with design, putting together those smaller deliverables, we know that we have feedback on those deliverables early. We know if this direction is approved or not approved. This reduces risk that feedback will be major. Definitely still a risk that feedback can be major if those deliverables weren't paid attention to. But providing smaller deliverables has led us to avoid situations where we get analysis paralysis, where we're looking at things and between the colors and the structure and the imagery, everything is just too overwhelming at once to provide any sort of structured, meaningful feedback. We break it up. We use mood boards. This is kind of a fun one. And style guides, or style tiles. So we built this out for a project for Amherst College a little while ago. Second risk, client isn't available to provide feedback on key deliverables in a timely manner. So every project begins with a project plan with key dates and timelines for that feedback, so that on these larger engagements, we know earlier, and the team knows earlier, everyone knows earlier, when this feedback is needed and when we will be giving them these key deliverables for feedback. And then weekly check-ins to make sure that we're delivering on our timeline, and if there are any changes to the timeline, then we're talking about them. If someone can't make the deliverable, if there's a vacation, a family emergency, a dog is sick, something, we know about it in advance and can plan around it. But yeah, let's be real. Should the feedback not be delivered on time, the project timeline may shift accordingly. Sometimes we can absorb it into the timeline, but depending on how drastic the difference is between when we ask for it and when we get it, we may have to shift the timeline. Key stakeholder provides all feedback at the 11th hour, the minute before it's due. The site's about to launch. So we like to get, in our initial project plan, a list of all individuals involved, their roles and their responsibilities, so that we identify, yeah, there is this dean of a school, or the CEO of a company, or the director of marketing, and they're not involved in the day-to-day of this project, but they are going to be a key voice in whether or not we can launch. We want to know about it. They don't need to be in our weekly stand-ups, but if we have to get their buy-in on something, we should at least have a line of communication to them. But yeah, again, should feedback not be delivered on time, the project timeline may shift accordingly. So a lot of times we found that these are just motivators. People don't want people don't know that a delay in giving us their feedback will shift the timeline. Then they're pretty motivated, we found, or they're more motivated, I should say, to make sure that we keep to that timeline because it's a shared risk. Business requirements are not fully established during discovery. So we have all those lines of questions, and we can talk about things all we want, but sometimes there are those hidden business goals that maybe the person you were talking to wasn't fully aware of. Maybe there's an internal misunderstanding. So we like to document all the business drivers because really we're building these sites to serve some business goal. We're not just building Drupal sites for the sake of building Drupal sites. Organizations invest in these because they expect some form of return. So we need to make sure that we're maximizing that potential. So we document what those things are, and then during our weekly check-ins or deliverables check-in, we relate back to that document to show how that document has informed all the work that we've done so far. But yeah, you're right. If we don't take into account those business goals and additional time is necessary, or we have to reevaluate kind of where we were, then we need to add time for that. New site content isn't ready on time. So yeah, new sites usually like to have some new content that's informed during a branding and a messaging strategy phase. So we'll develop the initial content strategy to inform the messaging, and during the sales cycle, we'll talk about things like writing content. And if the client has a writer, fantastic. We'll work with them to develop this branding and messaging guide, and then we'll transition that to their role, and there'll be times and dates for those check-ins to make sure that we actually have content, because we don't want to be building sites with lorem ipsum. And also, real content is super helpful during the information architecture and content modeling phase to make sure that the intent behind each field is accurate. We don't want a content type with a bunch of text fields if that's not really appropriate. And then satisfaction. Internal personas may find site features overwhelming. This is interesting on large-scale projects where folks are coming from a non-CMS, or they're on a CMS that's not Drupal, or they are on Drupal, and if it was built a few years ago, it's probably like the Wild West. They can do whatever they want, or maybe they can't do whatever they want, but there are things that they need to do that they can't seem to figure out how to do. It's a completely new software, so it's definitely a consideration. We want to make sure that we're building this tool. People need to feel empowered to use it. So we work with IA to confirm that users will be able to update what they need to update from the onset. So we'll prevent this risk by using training documentation, such as getting started guides, and introduce the work to a select few of those folks as we're working through IA to get feedback to make sure that, hey, I'm responsible for the events in my department, but for some odd reason, I can't put a location for this event. So what do we do about that? But yeah, very real risk that internal personas may still find the site difficult to manage, and there are other items we can do to help with that, like guided tours or customizable user dashboards. But really, those things would shift the timeline and the budget, I think, to make sure we're implementing those correctly. Those are implementing guided tours and customizable user dashboards. Sounds pretty cool, but it can be pretty complicated on a technical level. So you've done your due diligence. You've thought about a lot of risks. Let's get started. We know all the things that can happen to jeopardize this project, and we have a plan in place. Everyone's feeling really positive. What do we do? Well, we start to work. And we're, managing this project, looking out for all the things, or maybe we're not. This is to say that we build this document, and it's a living document that we need to relate back to on a regular basis, because just because you write it down doesn't mean that the risk is completely mitigated, and you may find yourself falling off the cliff. I call that risk blindness. Cheers. I don't know, but I think I have a few minutes if people have questions or anything. Cool.
It's not risky to ask a question.
That's true. That's true.
Is going to be available?
The big one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can post the slides as a PDF. Definitely not you. Yeah. Yeah. Can just So yeah, the cone of confidence is a visual representation of how confident we are in the project. So when a project begins, we may find ourselves at not very confident. So we have about quarter confidence. And then on the other end of that, we need to, this is going back to the insurance premium idea, we need higher premiums to account for the fact that there are a lot of unknowns. So these numbers are widely, it's not a science, more of an art, in that you don't have to multiply the things you don't know by 4. That may lead to, like, I don't know, really extreme estimates. But they help articulate the risk. Your multiplier that you would want to use for your estimate. This isn't to say that someone asks you, hey, can you do this really quick thing? And you're like, yeah, certainly, but I don't know anything about it, so it's 4 times. This is more just to illustrate the fact that just because you don't know what it is, you should ask those questions and document these things so that you can accurately estimate things. Because no one wants to do anything like that. Like it's like a penalty. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, that's the confidence of our plan. Sorry? Oh, yeah. So the confidence number is how confident we are that we're able to mitigate the risk. It's how confident we are in our plan to mitigate the risk. So I guess that may be kind of the same thing. Any others? Cool. Thank you.
So we've got a